Welcome back to Whispered Wisdom, where you can relax and drift into a peaceful sleep while we explore the most curious corners of history. Tonight, we'll be taking a journey through some of the most useless laws that have ever been passed. Laws that no one follows, and in many cases, no one even remembers. These laws might seem strange, funny, or downright bizarre, but they all offer a glimpse into the past, where things weren't always as logical as they seem today. So, as you settle in and let the weight of the day melt away, get comfortable, let your body relax and your mind unwind as we dive into the peculiar world of pointless laws. Allow these oddities from history to guide you into a restful sleep, where your mind can wander peacefully and freely. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The 18th century ban on wearing armor in the streets. In the 14th century, armor was a symbol of power and status, but in 1313, King Edward II of England passed a strange law forbidding people to wear armor in public spaces, particularly on the streets. You might wonder why such a law would exist in the first place. The reasoning behind this law was that it was becoming too common for people, often knights or nobles, to walk around in their full battle gear. It was seen as unnecessary and potentially dangerous for ordinary citizens to be constantly armed in public. It's hard to imagine today, but at the time, wearing armor in the street was a way to show off your wealth and status. But for some reason, Edward II thought this practice had gone too far, so he passed this law. And yet, despite the decree, armor was rarely confiscated, and the law wasn't enforced strictly. In fact, most people continued to wear their armor when they felt the need to. It was a rule that quickly fell out of practice and eventually became a mere footnote in history. It serves as a perfect example of how sometimes laws are put in place without much regard for whether or not anyone will actually follow them. Chapter 2. The prohibition of the use of noisy tools in the City of London. Imagine this. It's a quiet evening in London in the 17th century, and suddenly the sound of a hammer ringing through the streets breaks the silence. It's not unusual to hear a bit of noise now and then, but what if it were outlawed? In 1682, the City of London passed a law that prohibited the use of noisy tools such as hammers, chisels, and other machinery. After 9 p.m., the law was intended to ensure that people could sleep peacefully at night, without the constant clattering of tools echoing through the streets. But, as you can imagine, this law proved completely impractical. How could you stop people from using tools at night, especially if their work was essential? As the years went by, the law became largely ignored. People would still work late into the night when necessary, and the sounds of hammers and chisels were just a part of life in the city. This law was a good idea in theory, providing peace and quiet for the people of London, but in practice, it was almost impossible to enforce. It's another example of a law that quickly faded into obscurity. Chapter 3. The law against petty theft in ancient Rome. In ancient Rome, you might be surprised to learn there was a law that made stealing a small amount of food or items a capital offense. In fact, under the Roman Empire, even the theft of something as minor as a loaf of bread could result in the death penalty. This law was passed as part of the Lex Julia Divi, Julian law of violence, which aimed to reduce crime and prevent public unrest. The reasoning was that by punishing petty theft harshly, people would be deterred from breaking the law in the first place. However, this law was hardly ever enforced. Why? because the penalties were seen as too severe for minor crimes, and it would have been impractical to execute so many people for petty theft. In fact, most instances of petty theft were handled with lighter consequences, like fines or public humiliation. The law, though harsh in its wording, was mostly ignored and eventually fell into disuse. Chapter 4. The ban on wearing high heels in 17th century England. In 1618, a curious law was passed in England forbidding women from wearing high heels. Yes, you heard that correctly. High heels were once banned. The law was enacted as a way to discourage women from dressing too extravagantly and to limit what was considered an unnecessary fashion trend at the time. King James I of England believed that high heels were a symbol of pride and vanity, and he was determined to put an end to it. In fact, he issued a proclamation saying that any woman caught wearing high heels would face punishment. What was the punishment? In reality, it was hard to enforce, as high heels remained quite popular despite the law. The ban was quickly forgotten, as women continued to wear heels in defiance of the rule, and the law became more of an odd historical tidbit than anything else. Fashion, it seemed, could not be so easily controlled by laws, and this was one of the first examples of how fashion would continue to defy authority. Chapter 5. The law against beards in Russia. In 1698, Tsar Peter the Great of Russia passed a law that required all men to shave their beards or pay a heavy tax. Tsar Peter, who was keen on modernizing Russia, wanted his people to adopt the fashion of Western Europe, where beards were considered old-fashioned. He thought that shaving beards would help his country look more modern and European. However, the law didn't go down well with the Russian population. Many people, particularly the nobility, saw beards as a symbol of their Russian heritage. As a result, many men paid the tax rather than shave their beards, which meant that the law wasn't all that effective in changing social behavior. In fact, the law was so unpopular that it was eventually repealed. This law serves as another example of how trying to dictate fashion or personal appearance through legal means is often doomed to fail. People's personal choices, especially in terms of style, are difficult to regulate, even by the most powerful leaders. Chapter 6. The ban on left-handed people in ancient Egypt. In ancient Egypt, being left-handed wasn't just considered inconvenient. It was outright illegal. The ancient Egyptians believed that the left hand was unlucky and associated it with dark magic and evil. As a result, they passed laws that made it illegal to use the left hand for anything important. This meant that people were forced to perform tasks with their right hand, even if they were naturally left-handed. From eating to writing, everything had to be done with the right hand. The law was meant to maintain social order, but in practice, it was highly impractical. It's hard to imagine how such a law could have been enforced on a daily basis, and in reality, it likely caused more frustration than it solved. Over time, the law was abandoned, but the superstition about left-handedness remained for centuries in many parts of the world. This is yet another example of a law that was based more on superstition and societal norms than practicality or reason. Chapter 7. The ban on kissing in public in 16th century England. In 16th century England, a peculiar law was passed that forbade kissing in public. This law, which was more about propriety than anything else, was part of an effort to regulate public behavior and maintain a sense of order in society. The law was intended to prevent displays of affection that were deemed excessive or inappropriate. However, as you might imagine, this law was almost impossible to enforce. Kissing is such a natural part of human interaction, and even in a time where strict social rules governed almost every aspect of life, the desire to show affection wasn't something that could easily be suppressed. Though the law existed for a time, it quickly became unenforceable and was often ignored by those in love. In fact, it soon became just another odd footnote in the long list of strange and overly stringent regulations of the time. Today, we look back and can't help but smile at the thought of such a law in a society that, in many ways, valued restraint and composure above all else. Chapter 8. The Ban on Spitting in the Streets of London. In 1565, the City of London enacted a law that banned spitting in public. This law was aimed at keeping the streets clean and preventing the spread of disease. At first glance, it seems like a perfectly reasonable regulation, but the truth is, it became almost impossible to enforce. Spitting, whether out of habit or necessity, is something that people do naturally, and despite the law, people continued to spit in the streets. The city government would fine people who were caught spitting, but it was hardly effective. As London grew and became more crowded, the idea of preventing every single spit became laughable. This law is an example of a well-intentioned rule that didn't stand up to the reality of daily life. Over time, it faded away, but it's still amusing to think about the lengths that cities would go to in order to regulate behaviors that were deeply ingrained in human nature. Chapter 9. The law against wearing noisy shoes in ancient Rome. In ancient Rome, there was a law that prohibited wearing shoes that made too much noise. The law, enacted by Emperor Augustus, was aimed at preventing excessive noise in the streets, as it was believed that loud footsteps disrupted the peace and serenity of the city. But in practice, the law was difficult to enforce, especially given the variety of shoes people wore at the time. Some shoes, such as the soli, were made of thin leather and would naturally make noise as people walked, and, just like the other odd laws we've discussed, this regulation became more of a suggestion than a rule. In the end, the law fell out of favor, and people continued to wear shoes with as much noise as they wished. The emperor's attempt to regulate sound in the streets was a reminder of how difficult it can be to legislate personal habits and the unpredictability of human behavior. Chapter 10. The law against men wearing skirts in ancient Rome. It's hard to imagine, but in ancient Rome, there was a law forbidding men from wearing skirts. The toga, a flowing garment often associated with Roman citizens, was the standard attire for men. However, the tunica, a garment resembling a skirt, was reserved for women, slaves, and foreigners. The law banning men from wearing skirts was an attempt by Roman society to preserve the distinction between the roles of men and women. The Romans were very particular about social hierarchies, and fashion was one of the ways they reinforced these distinctions. But just as with many other laws in history, this one didn't always hold up. Some Roman men, especially those of higher status, began to wear skirts in defiance of the law, seeing it as a form of personal expression. The law eventually became irrelevant, as the line between acceptable fashion choices became less rigid over time. Chapter 11. The law against the use of the word obesity in 19th century France. In the 19th century, the French government passed an odd law prohibiting the use of the word obesity in public discourse. The law was created as part of an effort to regulate public health and control how the issue of weight was discussed in society. The idea behind the law was that talking about obesity would only encourage people to focus on their weight, which, according to officials, would lead to body shaming and mental distress. So, to preserve the dignity of individuals, the law attempted to outlaw the very term itself. But like many of the laws we've explored, this one quickly lost its effectiveness. People still spoke about obesity and weight in private, and the word continued to be used in medical circles. Eventually, the law faded away, and the idea that laws could govern such a personal aspect of life was abandoned. Chapter 12. The law against flatulence in 16th century France. This one is perhaps the most amusing of all. In 16th century France, King Louis XIV enacted a law that prohibited flatulence. Yes, flatulence in public places. The law, believed to be passed as a joke by the king, was meant to curb public disturbances and keep the court's decorum intact. It's hard to imagine how this law was ever taken seriously. The idea that flatulence could be outlawed seems absurd, especially considering that it's a natural bodily function. But in a time where social etiquette was taken to such extremes, even something as ordinary as a breaking of wind was seen as a breach of manners. While the law was rarely enforced, it became a part of the folklore surrounding King Louis XIV's reign. And as strange as it sounds, this is an example of how the Victorians and their predecessors took matters of public behavior and decorum to sometimes comical extremes. Chapter 13. The ban on the color purple in ancient Rome. In ancient Rome, during the reign of Emperor Aurelian, a law was passed that prohibited ordinary citizens from wearing purple clothing. Purple was a color reserved solely for the emperor and his family, symbolizing their divine status. The dye used to create the color was extremely rare and expensive, made from the secretions of a particular type of mollusk, which made it a symbol of wealth and power. The law was clear. Anyone caught wearing purple clothing without authorization could face punishment. This might seem like an extreme rule, but the Romans were very particular about distinguishing the elite from the common folk, and purple became a visual marker of social hierarchy. Yet, as history shows, fashion cannot be easily controlled. People continued to try and wear the color in secret, or would use inferior dyes that were similar in shade but not quite as rich. The law eventually became unenforceable, as purple clothing, though still rare, was no longer solely for the emperor. By the time of later emperors, the restriction on purple was forgotten, and the color became associated with luxury for all people, not just those of royal blood. Chapter 14. The law against sitting down in ancient Egypt. In ancient Egypt, there existed an odd rule. No one, not even the king, was allowed to sit in the presence of the gods or the pharaoh without permission. This rule was intended to demonstrate reverence for the divine and respect for the highest authority. To stand before the gods, with head bowed and body upright, was a mark of respect and humility. However, this law applied not only to religious ceremonies, but to the daily life of the Egyptians, who considered sitting a privilege reserved for only a select few. To sit in the presence of someone of higher social status, such as the pharaoh or a priest, was considered a sign of disrespect, akin to an offense. In practice, This law likely wasn't followed strictly by the general population. While it served as a symbol of devotion and discipline, it must have been incredibly difficult to enforce in daily life. After all, even pharaohs needed to rest occasionally. Over time, this rule faded into history, a peculiar relic of a society that valued formality above all else. Chapter 15. The No-Cat Laws of Medieval England. During the Middle Ages, in a time when superstition was at its peak, certain laws were created to regulate what could only be described as evil omens. Among the most peculiar was the law that banned cats from being in certain areas of England. This strange law stemmed from the widespread belief that cats were linked to witches and were thought to have magical powers. Cats were associated with the supernatural, and many believed that they could transform into witches' familiars or possess spirits that could cause harm. The law against keeping cats was meant to protect the public from potential witchcraft, as people feared that the presence of cats could bring bad luck or evil influence. Of course, cats have always been difficult to control, and despite these laws, they continued to roam the streets, even in places where they were officially banned. Over time, the laws against cats fell out of favor, and the animals remained a beloved part of life in England and beyond. It's a fascinating example of how fear of the unknown led to rules that were impossible to enforce, but also ultimately irrelevant in the face of nature's persistence. Chapter 16. The bizarre law banning chocolate in France. In 18th century France, a law was passed that prohibited the sale of chocolate in certain regions due to the belief that it was too stimulating for the mind and body. The French had a deep love for sweets, but when chocolate was introduced to France, some authorities became concerned about its effect on people's behavior. The law was fueled by the belief that chocolate caused excessive excitement and even led to immoral behavior. At the time, chocolate was a rare luxury, often reserved for the wealthiest in society, and some saw it as an indulgence that could lead to excess. Despite the law, the popularity of chocolate was undeniable. People continued to consume it, and its reputation only grew. The ban didn't last long, and by the late 18th century, chocolate had become an essential part of French culture, eventually leading to the sweet treats we enjoy today. This law serves as a reminder of how easily fear of new things can result in attempts to restrict the pleasures of life, only for those pleasures to ultimately win out. Chapter 17. The law banning umbrellas. In 18th century Paris, imagine walking through the streets of Paris in the 1700s when an odd law was passed forbidding umbrellas from being used in public. The reasoning behind this rule, it was seen as a strange foreign import, something that was considered an unnecessary and effeminate accessory in the highly fashionable streets of Paris. Some authorities even thought that umbrellas were too practical for the elite, who should rely on their servants to shield them from the rain. Despite this, the umbrella became a symbol of status in some parts of the city, as it was often carried by those who could afford it. But just as many of the strange laws we've explored, this one was not so easily enforced. As time passed, the umbrella eventually became accepted, and now it's a staple of everyday life. Still, it's hard not to smile at the image of Parisians in the 1700s walking through the rain, holding their hats over their heads in defiance of the law. Fashion and practicality often clash, but in the case of the umbrella, practicality eventually won the day. Chapter 18. The law banning snakes. from being pets in ancient Greece. In ancient Greece, keeping snakes as pets was once banned by law, while today many people enjoy keeping snakes as exotic pets. The Greeks saw the creatures as dangerous and associated them with evil omens and dark magic. The law prohibited people from owning snakes in their homes, believing that the animals might bring bad luck or curse the household. This law, much like the others we've discussed, wasn't entirely effective. People who had snakes would often hide them in their homes, defying the regulations in favor of their fascination with these creatures. Snakes, with their mysterious nature and often fearsome appearance, had a unique appeal for some Greeks, despite the societal disapproval. As we know today, snakes continue to be kept as pets by many around the world, and their reputation has evolved. The fear-based laws against them gradually faded as attitudes toward these creatures changed, showing that even laws born from superstition are often unable to withstand the test of time. Chapter 19. The law against eating ice cream on Sundays in 18th century England. In the 18th century, a law was passed in England forbidding people from eating ice cream on Sundays. The law was part of a broader movement to limit excessive pleasures and to ensure that Sundays remained a day of rest and worship. Ice cream, being a luxurious and indulgent treat at the time, was seen as inappropriate for a day meant for spiritual reflection and restraint. The law was rarely enforced, but it spoke to the puritanical values that were prevalent during that era. The idea that something as simple and joyful as enjoying a sweet treat could be forbidden on a specific day of the week might seem amusing to us now, but it was part of a much larger effort to regulate personal behavior. While the law eventually fell out of practice, it's fascinating to think about how something as innocent as eating ice cream could once be seen as a violation of religious principles. And yet, as time went on, ice cream became an enduring symbol of indulgence and celebration, an example of how taste, culture, and even laws evolve with society. Chapter 20. The law against whistling in public in 19th century Japan. In 19th century Japan, a law was passed that forbade whistling in public. The reasoning behind this was that whistling was believed to attract evil spirits and bad luck. In fact, it was considered so serious that children were warned not to whistle at night, lest they call upon spirits who would bring misfortune to their families. This superstition led to the creation of the law, which sought to preserve peace and prevent the spread of bad energy. Of course, whistling is a natural human behavior, something we often do absent-mindedly while walking or working. So just like with other strange laws, this one proved difficult to enforce. Though the law was rarely adhered to in its entirety, the fear of attracting evil spirits lingered for many years, especially among the older generations. Over time, this belief faded, and whistling became just a cheerful, harmless habit once again. This law, like so many others, serves as a reminder of how culture and superstition can shape the laws of a society, often in ways that seem strange to us today. Chapter 21. The law against owning a dog in ancient Egypt. In ancient Egypt, there was a peculiar law that forbade the common people from owning dogs. The animals were seen as symbols of the gods and were considered too sacred to be kept as pets by ordinary citizens. Dogs were instead reserved for the royal family and high priests, who treated them with great reverence. This law was based on the belief that animals, especially dogs, had a special connection to the divine. But as with many restrictive laws, it quickly became impractical. People who wanted dogs as companions would often resort to hiding their pets from authorities, risking punishment just for the comfort of having a loyal animal by their side. Over time, the law was forgotten, and dogs once again became popular as pets among the general population. It's interesting to think about how an entire society, rich in culture and reverence for animals, could pass such a law and yet still have people who defied it for the sake of companionship. It speaks to the deep bond between humans and animals that transcends time and societal rules. Chapter 22. The law against having multiple marriages in ancient China. In ancient China, during the Qin dynasty, there was a law that prohibited individuals from having more than one spouse. While polygamy had been practiced in earlier dynasties, this law was a radical shift toward monogamy. The intention behind it was to reduce the complexities of inheritance and to maintain a stable, orderly society. At first glance, it seems like a logical law for a structured society, but as with many laws that sought to regulate personal lives, it was not easy to enforce. In reality, many people continue to have multiple spouses, especially among the wealthy and the aristocracy, who could afford to maintain multiple households. The law did not hold up for long, and by the time of the Han Dynasty, polygamy was once again common practice. This law serves as an example of how deeply personal decisions, such as whom to marry, are often influenced by the culture and politics of the time, and even the most well-intentioned laws may not be able to dictate human nature. Chapter 23. The law against drinking coffee in Prussia. In the 18th century, Frederick the Great of Prussia enacted a law that sought to encourage the consumption of beer instead of coffee. The law was based on the belief that coffee consumption was unpatriotic, as it reduced beer sales and undermined the country's brewing industry. Frederick believed that coffee was not only a foreign import, but that it threatened the local economy by replacing beer, a drink that had long been part of Prussian culture. So in 1777, he issued a decree that taxed coffee and discouraged its use. People were encouraged to drink beer instead, and those who consumed coffee were subject to a hefty tax. The law was largely ineffective, as people continued to drink coffee, often in secret, due to its popularity across Europe. The law was eventually rescinded, and coffee found its place as a beloved drink in many parts of the world. But Frederick's decree remains a curious and amusing example of how governments sometimes legislate personal habits in efforts to promote national pride or economic interests. Chapter 24. The ban on playing cards in France. In 17th century France, King Louis XIV passed a law that forbade the use of playing cards in public places. This law was designed to curb gambling and maintain public order, but in reality, it was nearly impossible to enforce. Playing cards, which had been introduced to France from Italy, quickly became popular, and by the 17th century, they had infiltrated French society. People began to play cards in their homes and public spaces, and it didn't take long for the law to be disregarded altogether. In fact, despite the royal decree, playing cards became a staple of social gatherings. Whether it was a friendly game in the courtyard or an impromptu match in the tavern, the law did little to stop people from enjoying their favorite pastime. Over time, the ban on playing cards was forgotten, and the pastime continued to thrive. This law, though based on a desire to maintain moral order, ultimately became another forgotten relic of a bygone era. Chapter 25. The law against flying kites in 18th century England. In the 18th century, England passed a peculiar law that banned flying kites in certain public spaces. The law was implemented due to safety concerns, as flying kites could be dangerous, especially when they got tangled in electrical wires or interfered with passing ships. But despite the risks, flying kites remained a popular hobby, and people continued to do so in defiance of the law. The idea that an innocent pastime could be outlawed for safety reasons seems odd to us today, especially since kites are now enjoyed by children and adults around the world as a peaceful outdoor activity. Over time, the law was lifted, and kite flying returned to its rightful place as a simple and enjoyable pastime. This law, like so many others, serves as a reminder of how societies try to regulate activities that are inherently harmless, only to find that people will always seek out their favorite activities, no matter the rules. Chapter 26. The law against holding public parades in ancient Greece. In ancient Greece, public parades were forbidden in many cities, as they were seen as an unnecessary display of wealth and power. The Greeks believed that public spectacles, such as parades, could stir up excessive pride and disrupt the balance of society. While some cities allowed parades in connection with religious festivals or military victories, they were often carefully regulated to ensure they didn't become too extravagant. This law was meant to maintain the humility that was so highly valued in Greek society. Despite the restrictions, parades did happen. In fact, some of the most famous Greek parades, such as those celebrating Olympic victories, were celebrated in defiance of the law. The desire to publicly celebrate achievements, whether personal or societal, proved stronger than any law against it. Chapter 27. The law against wearing shoes on Sundays in 17th century England. In 17th century England, there was a peculiar law that forbade wearing shoes on Sundays. This law was part of a larger movement to ensure that Sundays were strictly reserved for rest, reflection, and prayer. The idea was that shoes were a symbol of work and worldly matters, so by removing them, people would be reminded of the importance of spiritual devotion. The law, of course, was mostly ignored. People continued to wear shoes on Sundays, especially when they needed to attend church or visit family members. However, the law remained in place for some time, as a reminder of the religious discipline that governed daily life. It's fascinating to think about how such a small thing, like whether or not to wear shoes, could become a matter of law. Though this particular regulation didn't last, it is an interesting glimpse into how laws can be shaped by religious beliefs and attempts to create a more pious society. In time, the law became a strange artifact of a bygone era, ultimately forgotten in the face of practicality. Chapter 28. The law against drinking coffee in the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire, known for its rich culture and love of coffee, passed a strange law in the 17th century that prohibited the consumption of coffee under certain circumstances. Sultan Murad IV, who ruled from 1623 to 1640, issued a decree that made drinking coffee a capital offense. Why? Sultan Murad IV believed that the social gatherings that centered around coffee drinking were breeding grounds for idleness, gossip, and subversion. As coffee houses became popular meeting places for intellectuals and rebels, the Sultan saw them as a threat to his authority. This law was ruthlessly enforced, and those caught drinking coffee were subject to severe punishments. However, despite the harsh law, coffee drinking continued to thrive in the empire. Coffee houses, once seen as places of rebellion, were simply too popular and too integral to society to be shut down. Eventually, the law was lifted, and coffee regained its rightful place as the beloved drink of the empire. Chapter 29. The law against bicycles in early 20th century France. In the early 1900s, there was a law in France that banned bicycles from certain parts of Paris. This was during a time when bicycles were growing in popularity, but they were still seen as a strange and unwelcome mode of transportation in some circles. The law was passed to regulate traffic and ensure that the streets were reserved for horse-drawn carriages. However, the law was mostly ineffective. As more and more people took to bicycles for commuting and recreation, it became impossible to enforce. Bicycles were simply too practical to be banned, and the law was soon forgotten as bicycles became a staple of life in Paris. This quirky law is an example of how societies sometimes resist new technologies or modes of transport, only to see them eventually become essential parts of daily life. The bicycle, despite being initially unwelcome, soon became a symbol of freedom and mobility for many. Chapter 30. The law against drinking beer in 18th century Prussia. In 1777, King Frederick the Great of Prussia issued a strange decree banning the drinking of beer in certain areas of the kingdom. The law was intended to encourage people to drink more wine, as Frederick believed wine was more civilized and associated with higher social status. The law was passed as part of Frederick's efforts to impose a more refined culture on his subjects. He thought beer was too common and wanted to replace it with wine, which was seen as a drink for the elite. But as with many such laws, the ban on beer was met with resistance. The people of Prussia, who had long enjoyed beer as a part of their daily life, continued to brew and drink it, regardless of the royal decree. Over time, the law became a laughingstock, and beer regained its rightful place as the drink of choice in the kingdom. Chapter 31. The law against marriage for left-handed people in 16th century Spain. In 16th century Spain, a strange law was passed that prohibited left-handed individuals from getting married. This law was rooted in the belief that left-handedness was a sign of a flawed character, and therefore left-handed individuals were considered unsuitable for marriage. The belief that left-handedness was somehow connected to evil or bad luck was common in many parts of Europe at the time. In Spain, this superstition became so widespread that the law was enacted to prevent left-handed people from marrying and creating imperfect families. Of course, the law was not only discriminatory but also completely impractical. Left-handed people, like anyone else, wanted to marry and have families, and many defied the law. Over time, the law was repealed, and left-handed people were allowed to marry as they wished. This law is an example of how superstitions can create laws that have no real basis in reality, and how such laws are often overturned as societies evolve. Chapter 32. The law against publicly wearing red in ancient Rome. In ancient Rome, there was a law that prohibited common citizens from wearing red clothing in public. Red was reserved for the elite, particularly for the highest-ranking senators and officials, as it was considered a color of power and status. This law was part of a larger effort by the Roman elite to distinguish themselves from the common people. It was a way of asserting social hierarchy, and wearing red was seen as an attempt to appropriate the status of the ruling class. As with many laws that attempt to regulate fashion, this one eventually became unenforceable. Common people began to find ways to wear red without being caught, and the law slowly faded away. Eventually, red became a color worn by people of all social classes, and the law was forgotten. Chapter 33. The law against eating certain types of fruit in ancient Rome. In ancient Rome, there was a strange law that prohibited certain types of fruit from being eaten during specific religious festivals. The reason behind this ban was tied to religious beliefs. Some fruits, like apples, were considered sacred to certain gods, and were only allowed to be eaten during certain ceremonies. Despite the best efforts of the authorities to enforce these dietary restrictions, people continued to consume the forbidden fruits in secret. The law was so difficult to enforce that it eventually became little more than a superstition, and by the time of the later Roman Empire, the ban was all but forgotten. This law serves as an interesting reflection of how cultures often attempt to regulate personal behavior, down to what we eat, based on religious or spiritual beliefs. While such laws may have been well-intentioned, they often fall apart when faced with the natural human desire for enjoyment and indulgence. Chapter 34. The law against wearing velvet in 17th century France. In 17th century France, King Louis XIII passed a law banning commoners from wearing velvet. Velvet, at the time, was a fabric reserved for the aristocracy and the royal family, as it was expensive and associated with wealth and status. The law was meant to maintain a visible social divide between the nobility and the rest of the population. But it was not strictly enforced. People continued to wear velvet in private, often hiding it under coats or cloaks to avoid punishment. Over time, velvet became less exclusive, and the law faded into history. It's fascinating to think about how something as simple as fabric could become a symbol of social status, and how laws were created to try to enforce such distinctions. Yet, as with so many laws based on class or appearance, this one eventually became irrelevant, as the fabric found its way into the wardrobes of people from all walks of life. Chapter 35. The law against wearing hats in 16th century England. In 16th century England, a peculiar law was passed that required men to wear hats in public, but only on Sundays. This law was introduced during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, who wanted to create a sense of uniformity and civility among her people. The idea was that wearing a hat on Sundays would be a sign of respect for the day of rest and reflection. However, this law also made it illegal to wear hats on any other day of the week. The reasoning was that people should not draw attention to themselves on other days by wearing hats that were too extravagant or ostentatious. It was a way to maintain modesty and prevent displays of wealth in a time when social hierarchies were rigidly defined. In practice, this law was largely ignored by the common people. Many continued to wear their hats every day, despite the legal restrictions. The law, though well-intentioned, was impossible to enforce, and it faded into history as society began to relax its views on personal appearance. Chapter 36. The law against wearing green in 17th century France. In 17th century France, there was a law that prohibited people from wearing the color green due to the association of green with jealousy, envy, and bad luck. The law was intended to prevent people from wearing the color on important occasions, especially weddings and other celebrations, as it was believed to bring misfortune to the person wearing it. Interestingly, this law was not applied uniformly across the entire country. In certain regions, green was still considered an acceptable color for everyday wear, but in other areas, particularly around the royal court, wearing green was seen as a violation of etiquette. Over time, the law became irrelevant, and green slowly regained its place as a color of choice for fashion, particularly for the wealthy and noble classes. Today, green is widely accepted and even seen as a symbol of growth and renewal, a far cry from the superstition that once surrounded it. Chapter 37. The law against wearing glasses in ancient Egypt. In ancient Egypt, there was a curious law that prohibited the use of glasses or spectacles in public spaces. The law was based on the belief that people who needed glasses were physically weak or flawed, and thus it was considered improper for them to be seen in public wearing corrective eyewear. This law was tied to the Egyptians' deep belief in physical perfection and the importance of outward appearances. People who had difficulty seeing were often treated with disdain, as their need for glasses was seen as a sign of imperfection. Despite this law, there are records that suggest some Egyptians did, in fact, use early forms of magnifying glasses to assist with reading or other tasks. However, these were kept private, as the law against wearing glasses in public was strictly enforced. As with many such laws, the law against glasses eventually faded away as glasses became more widely accepted in societies around the world. Today, glasses are no longer a symbol of weakness, but are a practical tool for improving vision. Chapter 38. The law against the use of mirrors in ancient Rome. In ancient Rome, there was a bizarre law that prohibited the use of mirrors in certain public spaces. The law was enacted by Emperor Tiberius, who believed that excessive attention to one's appearance was a form of vanity that could lead to social instability. Tiberius thought that people who spent too much time looking at their reflections in mirrors were more likely to become distracted and therefore less focused on their duties to the empire. He believed that focusing on one's appearance would lead to moral decay and undermine the strength of the Roman state. While this law was rarely enforced in its entirety, it did reflect the Roman tendency to regulate even personal behavior. The desire to maintain public order and moral standards often led to the creation of laws that, in hindsight, seem overly restrictive and impractical. Eventually, the law against mirrors faded, and the use of mirrors returned to public life. Though Tiberius's belief in their potential to corrupt continued to influence certain social norms for centuries. Chapter 39. The law against public sneezing in medieval Europe. In medieval Europe, sneezing was believed to be a sign that the soul was temporarily leaving the body. To prevent this from happening, people were often forbidden to sneeze in public, as it was seen as a sign of weakness or even evil spirits attempting to enter the body. There were even laws in some regions that fined people for sneezing in public spaces. The law required people to go to great lengths to conceal sneezing, including holding their noses or sneezing into their sleeves to prevent anyone from noticing. These laws, however, were hardly effective. Sneezing is a natural bodily function that cannot be controlled, and over time the superstitions surrounding it faded. Today, sneezing in public is seen as nothing more than a minor inconvenience. and people continue with their day without concern for ancient laws. Chapter 40. The law against public dancing in 16th century England. In 16th century England, there was a strange law that forbade public dancing during certain religious festivals. The law was introduced as a way to ensure that people would focus on spiritual matters rather than indulge in frivolous pleasures like dancing. The belief behind this law was that public dancing was a distraction from prayer and religious observance. In a society where religion played a central role in daily life, this law was intended to keep people focused on their spiritual duties. However, as you might imagine, the law didn't stop people from dancing. Even during religious festivals, people continued to dance, often in secret or in defiance of the rule. The law, despite its best intentions, was quickly abandoned and became a humorous footnote in the history of social regulations. Chapter 41. The law against drinking water in ancient Greece. In ancient Greece, there was a peculiar law that restricted the consumption of water during certain religious ceremonies. The law was passed in an attempt to preserve the sanctity of sacred rituals and prevent distractions from the spiritual experience. The Greeks believed that drinking water during a religious ceremony would dilute the purity of the moment, and that it was important to remain focused and reverent. As a result, the law prohibited participants from drinking water during certain parts of the ceremony. Despite the law, people still found ways to stay hydrated, often secretly drinking water when they thought no one was looking. The law, like many others based on religious beliefs, faded over time as society's views on hydration and ritual evolved. Chapter 42. The law against eating spicy foods in ancient Rome. In ancient Rome, there was a law that prohibited the consumption of excessively spicy foods, particularly in the presence of guests or during formal gatherings. The law was intended to maintain decorum and prevent people from eating foods that might be seen as too common or barbaric. The Romans believed that spicy foods, especially those imported from distant lands, were a sign of poor taste and bad manners. This law was part of a larger effort to maintain a sense of refinement and sophistication at public events. However, as with many other laws that sought to regulate taste, this one proved difficult to enforce. People continued to enjoy spicy foods in private, and over time, the law was quietly abandoned. Today, spicy foods are beloved by people all over the world, with no regard for the ancient Roman restrictions. Chapter 43. The law against washing clothes in the river in medieval France. In medieval France, there was an unusual law that prohibited washing clothes in public rivers. This law was enacted during a time when public rivers were not only used for washing clothes, but also for other daily activities, such as drinking, bathing, and fishing. The law was introduced to prevent the contamination of drinking water and to ensure that rivers remained clean for all purposes. But despite the law, people continued to wash their clothes in the river, as it was often the most convenient method. The idea of regulating water usage in such a natural and necessary way seems foreign to us now, but it's a reminder of how societies in the past had to create rules to maintain order and cleanliness in the face of practical realities. Eventually, this law faded, but it's an interesting example of how public health and hygiene laws were often ahead of their time. Chapter 44. The law against laughing in the courtroom in ancient China. In ancient China, There was a law that prohibited laughing during legal proceedings in courtrooms. The law was designed to maintain the seriousness and dignity of the legal process, as laughter was seen as a sign of disrespect toward the court and the legal system. According to the law, anyone caught laughing during a trial could be fined or even jailed, as it was considered a disturbance of the public order. In a society where respect for authority and tradition was paramount, this law aimed to ensure that legal matters were treated with the utmost gravity. While this law might seem extreme, it was likely a product of the cultural values of the time, where public decorum and social harmony were considered essential. Over time, as legal systems evolved, such strict regulations on public behavior were relaxed, and today courtrooms are a much more relaxed place for the public to observe. Chapter 45. The law against owning a pet pig in ancient Egypt. In ancient Egypt, there was a strange law that prohibited commoners from owning pet pigs. Pigs were considered impure and unclean animals by the ancient Egyptians, and owning one was thought to be a violation of religious and cultural norms. The law likely stemmed from Egypt's complex religious beliefs, where cleanliness and purity were highly valued. Pigs, as scavengers, were seen as symbols of filth and contamination, making them unsuitable as pets in a society that placed such importance on ritual purity. Despite the law, it's likely that some people in ancient Egypt continued to keep pigs, albeit in secret or in defiance of societal norms. The law eventually faded into history as Egypt's religious practices shifted and evolved over time. Today, pigs are kept as pets and raised for farming in many parts of the world, far removed from their ancient association with impurity. Chapter 46. The law against public farting in ancient Greece. In ancient Greece, farting in public was considered a grave social faux pas, so much so that there were laws against it. Public flatulence was seen as a violation of decency and an offense to the gods, particularly because it was considered an uncontrolled, impolite bodily function. The law was part of a larger cultural belief that the body and its functions needed to be controlled in public settings, as they could disrupt the harmony and order that Greek society prized. In the case of public farting, it was seen as a sign of poor manners and disrespect for others in the vicinity. Interestingly, despite the law, people still farted in public, and the law became little more than a humorous example of how even the most natural human behavior could be subject to regulation. Today, of course, farting is still a social taboo, but it no longer carries the legal penalties that it once did in ancient Greece. Chapter 47. The law against drinking water in public. In Victorian England, there was an odd law that prohibited the drinking of water in public places, particularly in parks or on the street. The law was designed to prevent people from appearing too poor or destitute, as drinking water in public was seen as a sign of lower social status. This law was rooted in the rigid class system that dominated Victorian society, where even basic actions like drinking water could be a reflection of one's social standing. The law was part of a larger effort to ensure that people maintained a certain level of decorum and dignity when out in public. As with many class-based laws, this one was impractical and often ignored. People continued to drink water when they needed it, and the law was eventually abolished as the rigid social structures of the Victorian era began to loosen. Today, drinking water in public is no longer seen as a class issue, and it's considered a basic human right. Chapter 48. The law against wearing green in ancient Japan. In ancient Japan, a law was passed that prohibited commoners from wearing the color green. The law was tied to the belief that green was a color associated with the supernatural, and wearing it was thought to attract bad luck or spirits. This superstition stemmed from Japan's deep connection to nature and the belief that certain colors could bring about misfortune or even death. The law was intended to protect people from these perceived dangers by restricting the use of the color green. Despite the law, people still found ways to wear green, often using it in their clothing in subtle ways, or choosing more muted shades of green that were less associated with superstition. Over time, the law faded, and green was once again embraced as a vibrant and natural color that was no longer feared. Today, green is one of the most widely used colors in fashion and design. Chapter 49. The law against eating spicy food in 16th century England. In 16th century England, there was a law that discouraged the consumption of spicy food, as it was believed to be an exotic and unhealthy indulgence. The law was part of a larger effort to regulate diet and ensure that people ate foods that were considered proper or traditional by English standards. At the time, spicy food was associated with foreign cultures, particularly those from India and the Middle East. The English elite considered these foods to be too foreign and unfamiliar to be included in the typical British diet. However, the law was largely ineffective, as the growing trade routes of the 16th century brought spices like pepper and cinnamon into England, where they were eagerly adopted by the upper classes. Over time, the law was forgotten, and spicy food became a popular addition to British cuisine. Today, spices are integral to many dishes in the UK and around the world, illustrating how tastes and food cultures evolve over time. Chapter 50. The law against the use of silk in ancient Rome. In ancient Rome, there was a law that restricted the use of silk, a luxury fabric imported from China. The law was passed because silk was considered a symbol of excess and luxury, something that was inappropriate for common citizens to possess. Silk, at the time, was extremely expensive and only accessible to the wealthiest members of society. The Roman government, fearing the growing divide between the rich and poor, enacted the law to prevent commoners from acquiring the fabric and further fueling the social inequality. However, despite the law, the desire for luxury items like silk was too strong to suppress. People found ways to acquire it, either through illegal trade or by finding cheaper substitutes. Over time, the law became ineffective, and silk became a common fabric in Roman society. Eventually, the prohibition on silk was lifted, and it became a symbol of wealth and power for people of all social classes. Conclusion. As we wrap up our journey through these pointless and outdated laws, it's fascinating to see how some of these seemingly strange regulations were once considered vital to maintaining order. And yet, many of these laws, whether due to their impracticality, absurdity, or the inevitable march of time, were ultimately forgotten or disregarded. Perhaps the most important lesson from these bizarre legal histories is that laws are often a reflection of the values and concerns of the time. What seemed like a critical rule then might appear utterly unnecessary today, just as the laws we take for granted now may someday seem just as pointless to future generations. So as you let go of the day's concerns and slip into a peaceful sleep, Remember that sometimes the most bizarre and curious laws are just one part of the vast and unpredictable story of human history. Good night, and may your dreams be as peaceful and free as the laws we no longer follow.